We now focus on the Japanese American experience during World War II, which deals with internment or imprisonment. That is to say, the entirety of the Japanese American population on the West Coast is going to be rounded up and sent into prison camps away from the West Coast right after the attack on Pearl Harbor. And still today, historians look back at this and notice that it's in a singular way. This is one of the most egregious and deplorable chapters in U.S. history in terms of violations of civil rights. And indeed, many Japanese American prisoners, when they were released with the conclusion of World War II, they repressed this memory psychologically. They did not want to confront it. And they did not want to speak about it, for example, with journalists and with the press, with the media. And it's interesting to note, therefore, that this chapter in U.S. history was repressed not only by Japanese Americans, but even by historians, writing the history of World War II. That was something that remained kind of absent for the longest time within the margins of the historical narrative. It wasn't until the 1980s, 70s and 80s, that especially from Japanese American leaders back then, they began to clamor for a public apology, a formal apology from the U.S. government. Not only that, they began to demand some kind of legal redress and compensation for the prisoners. And that's when this chapter became more well known. And indeed, many of you may have heard of this already, but I would say that, 50, 60 years ago, this chapter of U.S. history was hardly known because, again, this historical repression and willful neglect and willful forgetting, really, within the historical narrative. Okay, so we've been talking about the brewing conflict between the Japanese Empire and the U.S. Empire. Japan, as we know, attained modernity at a phenomenal pace, and they achieved this meteoric rise to become a great empire pretty much by the turn of the 20th century. And they modernized not only their society and even to an extent their culture, but even their foreign policy was marked by this pursuit of empire, in emulation, of course, of the other great European empires. But it was inevitably going to clash with those empires that already stood in Japan's way. Those empires, that is, that were already in the Pacific, and in particular, that's the U.S. empire. And we've been discussing how the Philippines itself, this very large area there in the South China Sea, stood in the way geographically of a lot of Japan's perceived necessities to prosecute this war in terms of natural resources, like their need for oil, their need for crucial natural resources like rubber and tin and so forth. So this clash was bound to happen, many historians feel, given that Japan was hell-bent on pursuing empire to the outer limits possible. And indeed, this would happen by December 7th and, December 8th as well, depending on where you were in the world. What happened was a simultaneous attack by the Japanese Empire on America's and England's colonial possessions, right? They all happened at the same general time frame. And when it came to Hawaii, that was December 7th. But they also attacked even parts of Singapore, even parts of the international community in Shanghai. They attacked Malaya. They attacked the Dutch East Indies and other smaller islands. And needless to say, the United States declared war on December 8th against the Japanese Empire. Now, this brings up the plight and predicament of Japanese Americans on U.S. soil. And of course, we know they are predominantly located in the West Coast, the U.S. West. Why? Because the reason they were in the United States in the first place, if you recall, is as a source of cheap labor. Many Japanese were escaping Japan because of its instability economically and politically. And it was on the U.S. West Coast, and even Hawaii that they could find a way to not only escape, but also achieve a modicum of economic mobility. And on the West Coast, it was predominantly the agricultural sector that they would find themselves in. Let's remember that they even attempted to buy land until that was prevented with the Alien Land Acts. But my whole point is you have a critical mass of Japanese Americans of 2 or perhaps even 3 generations by this time. Okay, the early 1940s. You have the Issei, which if you recall, are the first generation. And then you also have the Nisei, and that's the Japanese who were born in America on U.S. soil, and therefore they're conferred citizenship by birthright. And perhaps you even had some 3rd generation back then, though I would imagine very small number. So these individuals would be the ones that would be caught in the hysteria and the siege psychology, if you will, that swept through the country, but especially in the West Coast, following the Pearl Harbor attack. And so the question that emerged right after the attack is, what would happen to the Japanese? I mean, this is what the Japanese were thinking. What's going to happen to us? But of course, Americans are thinking, most of them are thinking, what should we do about the Japanese on the West Coast? So this is all setting up here this gradual step towards internment, which, just to jump a little bit ahead, this would be official by February 1942 with the passage of Executive Order 9066. Now, before I launch into the specific historical details that surround Japanese Americans from, let's say, the day after Pearl Harbor through the official passage of Executive Order 9066 that required their internment, through their release in 1945, well, I have to first introduce some key arguments regarding this episode of Japanese internment. And I will provide some evidence for this along the way. Now, here is a key argument, probably the main argument here, is that their imprisonment or internment was driven more by race rather than military necessity. By the way, another way to translate the term military necessity, that's actually the official term that the government and U.S. Army used, okay, military necessity. But another way to translate that, that's a familiar term nowadays, is national security. Okay, so the two terms are coterminous, so to say. But the argument is going to be made that despite the fact that the U.S. government and the U.S. military deemed it a matter of military necessity, what really is the root cause of this internment were racial reasons. And this dovetails right into this notion of Orientalism, which I introduced earlier, and I will discuss very soon. I will recap, of course, what this refers to. But the argument here is that Orientalism may not appear in government rationale. Actually, what does appear is the term military necessity, right? It may not be expressly stated in Executive Order 9066 if you read it even today, right? But that is indeed the underlying reason. And again, I will provide some evidence for this. Another thing to recognize here is that, when we think about Japanese internment today, we usually cite this, or may even imagine this, as this, of course, egregious, right, but nonetheless isolated incidents, perhaps wrought by, wartime hysteria again, or paranoia, fear of being invaded, or Pearl Harbor, or a version of an attack on the West Coast. But in fact, that is not the way to view it if you analyze this event from the perspective of Asian American history. Okay, because one thing that's not known among most Americans is that Asian Americans have been victims of racial violence almost since the beginning they set foot on U.S. soil. On the West Coast, for example, the first Chinese that came here to work during the gold rush in 1949. And then you had the Japanese follow them, which we discussed. And then later you'll see Filipinos. But in any case, when you analyze it from that perspective, you'll recognize that violence was always present. And the abridgment of their rights, their freedoms, was always happening. So the way you should think of Japanese internment is not as this singular or episodic event. That's the key word I want to use here, okay, as noted here on the slide. Internment was not episodic, but it was actually continuous, meaning that, it was from the beginning, right, of Asian American experience through the decades, even by this time, almost a century, if you're talking about between 1840s and 1940s. But it's rather continuous. It's a continuous thread, right, in terms of Asian American experience. One thing that you could recognize is that Asians have been victimized by, as I mentioned, racial violence, not to mention the infringement of their civil rights. And then it seems that internment, their imprisonment, that is to say, rounding up an entire racial group on the West Coast and placing them in, concentration camps may seem like, wow, that's just isolated, right? Well, no, not from the Asian American perspective. In fact, you could see it as the culmination of that ever since the first Asians arrived. Okay, and finally, the key argument that's going to be made is that, indeed, Japanese Americans were loyal. And I will discuss the specific ways by which they demonstrated their loyalty. And just to kind of foreshadow here, a big reason why it was argued among Americans that the Japanese Americans should be imprisoned away from the West Coast is because they are not loyal to the United States. You can't trust them. And of course, if you're a Japanese American on the West Coast, you're a Nisei, to use their term, and, you just scratch your head and wonder why you can't be trusted even though you're American. Any person of, for example, second generation, that's to say your parents are immigrants, right? But you're born here, you feel like you're American more so than your parents' culture. Most of us do. And therefore, of course, you're going to be loyal, right? Of course, you're going to be willing to serve your country, especially during a justifiable war, a just war like World War II. Now, again, they're going to demonstrate this by certain actions that they're going to take, which we will discuss in this particular section of the lecture.